From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A California committee votes to recommend that the state make hundreds of billions in cash payments in racial reparations. We'll go through just how wild this idea is, but how it may be a new Democratic norm. Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kim Strassel, joined today by my two fabulous colleagues, Alicia Finley and Kate Batchelder Odell. Let's start with reparations. Even a few years ago, people would just have categorized as outrageous and unworkable. Yet it is slowly being mainstreamed by the progressive left, and here we are. On the weekend, a 9-member panel created by California Governor Gavin Newsom and the state's Democratic Legislature voted to redistribute as much as $800 billion in payments to any Black American, presumably those in the state, who claim to be descendants of slaves. Now, interestingly, California's Constitution abolished slavery in 1849, but this panel claims that the state bears responsibility for slavery that happened in other southern states, and also that the lingering effects of slavery, including basically up to present day, should also entitle Black Americans to some categories of compensation based on types of discrimination. Alicia, I know you went through this recommendation. Can you lay out a bit better the idea behind this and also the specific payouts that they are proposing here? Because it's interesting, they are quite specific. It's a concrete example of when you get down to a big idea like this and you have to get through the policy nitty-gritty, you kind of realize how insane some of this becomes.
Right. So as you mentioned, California's 1849 Constitution banned slavery. So ostensibly, from a legal standpoint, there should be actually no justification for these kinds of payments. But the committee members, this is a 9-member committee that was appointed by the governor and state legislature to examine this issue in 2021, they claimed that the state legislature and government was dominated by pro-slavery forces, and therefore they were complicit in Southern slavery at the time. And then they make this kind of circuitous argument that, well, the effects of slavery continue to linger in terms of discrimination, which of course there was, the separate but equal, which postdated even the 13th Amendment and then the abolition of slavery. And so there were the discrimination did continue. But then they kind of make these leaps by claiming that, well, quote unquote, overpolicing mass incarceration were legacies of slavery and quote unquote, war on drugs. So the panel recommends that each African American who claims to have been a descendant of slaves is eligible for $2,352 for each year they have lived in California during the quote-unquote war on drugs, because Blacks were disproportionately incarcerated during those years, or at least that's their claims. Then they go on to claim that, well, they also suffered housing discrimination during the years of 1933 through 1977, before the Fair Housing Act kind of banned quote-unquote redlining. So all slavery descendants would also be entitled to $3,366 for each year they lived and stayed between those years. And then they say, well, the effects of slavery are also continue to manifest in terms of the life expectancy gap between Blacks and whites and worse health outcomes for Blacks in many cases. And that therefore all slavery descendants would be entitled to $13,619 for each year that they have lived in California total. So the commission's estimate would be that up to 2 million Black Americans could be eligible for as much as $1.2 million. And as you mentioned, that it could, all told, could cost more than $800 billion. The state doesn't have that much money. I mean, the entire state budget, including federal funds, is around $300 billion. And right now the state is facing estimated $35 billion deficit. So I'm not sure how they plan to come up with this money.
Well, it's completely fascinating, too, as you were rolling through those numbers, because I guess there must be some sort of mathematical, quantitative idea behind each of these, but the specificity of these numbers, $3,366 for each year because of housing discrimination. I mean, why not $3,367? It's a very, very fascinating example of how these policies end up being manifested once you start putting them down on paper. But Kate, One thing that really strikes me here is how policies like this are also essentially going to force us to push at some boundaries of race and identity. Meaning, it's one thing to talk about a young African American living in California today whose parents are African American and grandparents were African American and great grandparents were African American and maybe descended from slaves. But as a younger generation, we're a melting pot in this country. And a lot of people today, they have all manner of race in their family history. I mean, and what is everyone in California going to go rush out now and take a 23andMe test to establish if they have someone in their history who counts or might qualify for some of this? And then what are the outer limits of that? But the other thing too, Kate, is how this bill is only dealing with the victims of African American slavery. If you were a Black immigrant who maybe was around in the 1930s and subject to some of the similar discrimination Alicia was describing, you apparently don't qualify, nor do any other races or nationalities that also over the history of this country, but also in California, have suffered, some abuse and discrimination over the years.
Right, Kim. I mean, to your point, Black immigrants who maybe even those who have had family in this country for a long time don't qualify. A couple other points that come to mind are Chinese Americans who were discriminated against under the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. You can start to make a very compelling case that other groups have suffered similar historical wrongs. And I think reducing that to a cash payment, I think Americans understand how unworkable that is and implausible it is. I think you end up drawing an arbitrary line here that is not defensible. I'd also add to, there doesn't appear to be any distinctions about, for instance, how much money someone earns now or whether they continue to be disadvantaged. And Americans generally have been more supportive of cash payments that are geared toward people who need the cash support versus who can point to a historical wrong to justify it. So those are just two concerns. The last one I might add quickly is that there will be difficulty in discerning who is eligible for this money and who is not. And that will just naturally lend itself to arbitrary distinctions as well. So I think it's really unworkable, Kim, and I think voters understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, Kate, which is, are we really going to make a cash awards to a young Black American in California who's currently making $1 million a year as a tech entrepreneur? How is that going to set in people's mind? Meaning that this entire program, which purports to claim to be remedying some sort of essential unfairness, could end up being incredibly unfair in terms of the way it distributes money today. Alicia, just to go back, a top line question, is this even legal? I mean, we have an equal protection clause in the Constitution, and yet we're talking about a state that is just made the recommendation that it is going to take all of California's taxpayer dollars and re-award them to certain people entirely on the basis of race. But the other question I'd also ask on top of that is this really even the best way to go about closing real disparities that exist out there? I mean, first of all, we've paid a lot of money over the years into social welfare programs, but that gets to the point that in a perfect world, we really don't want to be abandoning entire communities to the tender mercies of forever state and federal handouts. We want things to actually get better. Doesn't California have plenty of policies out there that are continuing to hurt African Americans today that they might be better served to focus on rather than just handing out more cash?
So, right, on your first point, the Constitution's the 14th Amendment prohibits government policies that discriminate based on broad racial classifications. Now, the Supreme Court has kind of made an exception in terms of college admissions, though that is now was being reheard or relitigated at the Supreme Court in the Harvard v. Students for Fair Admissions case. So that is now currently under review. But what the state appears to be doing here is it appears to be trying to straddle the issue by saying, well, federal courts have actually allowed, in some cases, narrowly tailored policies to remedy past discrimination. So let's say somebody was discriminated against, a Black person was discriminated in a job application or job interview or some ways, then they might be entitled, or there may be a class action lawsuit or something like that. They might be entitled to some kinds of damages. But the Supreme Court also said, and this was back in one of those those litmus cases or a landmark case in 1988 in Richmond, city of Richmond, actually a California city, versus Crossing Company, that, just quote unquote generalized assertions of past racial discrimination cannot justify kind of current day discrimination, which is essentially what the reparations would do. These are just generalized assertions. And so it's not an individual that doesn't have to actually prove that he himself has been subject, or he and his family have been subject to, housing discrimination in the past, or alleged over policing or any of that. These are just generalized assertions that say that, this whole class of people, or a whole class of blacks who are descendants of slaves, have been subject to racial discrimination, and that is the ostensible legal justification for the reparations. So I have a hard time seeing this being upheld in a state or federal court. Now, on the second point that you made, well, doesn't California have other policies that are essentially keeping blacks down? Well, yes, there are a lot of it. And I would say the public school system is actually probably, systemically racist, if you want to borrow the left's favorite term, in terms of there are a lot of policies, and this was actually subject of a state lawsuit about over a decade ago, that was brought by some minority students and their parents against the state laws that protect teacher tenure for after 3 years, seniority rights. And what they actually, in this lawsuit, was really interesting is they went through and actually documented how these policies disproportionately impacted minorities who are essentially trapped in these failing schools. Like, you can't fire these bad teachers, and the young ones who are good teachers end up being fired when there are layoffs. And one of the points actually really jumped out at me. It was like, a single year with a grossly ineffective teacher can cost students $1.4 million in lifetime earnings for a classroom. And that's essentially, these grossly ineffective teachers are concentrated in heavily minority schools in urban school districts. So one policy that California could undertake that would help reduce racial disparities, would be just give every kid a voucher in these minority neighborhoods, and they would be allowed to go and go to private school, or perhaps even expand schools' choice to allow, students to attend schools in other districts. With charter schools would help. They have dramatically better records than the traditional public schools. Another policy would just be to actually drop its war on fossil fuels. I mean, there's a certain irony is in the last decade, a lot of the biggest opponents of a lot of the California's green policies, it's EV mandates. There was actually a legislation, I think about a decade ago, to ban fracking. The biggest opponents among Democrats were minorities, because these policies disproportionately harm minority communities and minority workers. And I'm thinking like Richmond, which is a heavily minority community, or down in Wilmington by Los Angeles. There are big refineries, and you have a lot of minority workers whose jobs are being threatened by the state's green regulation. And actually, interestingly, that is probably one reason why you have so many blacks actually leaving California. There has been a net exodus of blacks from California. So it's not just rich people leaving, it is working class minorities who are looking for a lower cost of living, lower taxes, all of that, more affordable housing, most of all. I mean, let's just get, the zoning regulations. I mean, the state reparations committee cited redlining. Well, essentially what the zoning regulations do nowadays in land use ordinances, and that include, these are imposed at the local level, but also there are some state policies there. They just drive up the cost of housing because they limit the supply and make it very difficult for minorities who are right now, essentially trapped in the inner cities to move out to nicer suburbs with better schools and other kinds of amenities. So what's happening is a lot of them are moving to Texas and Arizona.